He never really loved my mother. Ashley said that sentence standing at a podium in front of 200 people, at her own mother's funeral, looking directly at me across a room full of folding chairs and lilies. And I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened next. I had a letter in my coat pocket at that exact moment, written in my wife's own handwriting, that would have proven completely and immediately exactly how wrong that sentence was. I want to explain why, and I promise you the reason is going to change how you understand everything that happened in that room. My name is Daniel Whitfield. I'm 61 years old. I've run a hardware and building supply store in Charleston, South Carolina, for over 3 decades, and I married my wife Elaine 17 years ago, when her daughter Ashley was 9 years old and still, in every visible way, deep in the specific grief of having lost her biological father, Marcus, to leukemia 18 months earlier. Elaine died 4 months ago of lung cancer after a fight that lasted just under 2 years, and the funeral I'm describing happened on a warm April afternoon at a church on Meeting Street where Elaine had attended services for most of her adult life. I want to tell you about Ashley before I tell you about the letter, because I don't think what happened at that funeral makes sense without understanding the full shape of our relationship first. Ashley is 26 now, a marketing coordinator living in Atlanta, and for the better part of 17 years, our relationship has carried a specific, careful distance that I want to be honest was largely, though not entirely, something I built myself on purpose, for reasons I did not explain to her, and that I only stopped keeping secret the moment I finally handed her that letter. She has her mother's exact laugh, a fact I've noticed and never once mentioned to either of them, a specific, unrestrained sound that catches people off guard the first time they hear it because it seems, for a half second, considerably too big for whatever room she's standing in. She got her stubbornness from Marcus, according to Elaine, who used to tell stories about her first husband's particular refusal to ever quite let an argument go until he'd fully made his point, a trait that showed up in Ashley constantly throughout her childhood, and that I came, over the years, to genuinely admire even as it occasionally made our own more limited interactions considerably more pointed than a purely cordial relationship might otherwise have been. If you've been enjoying stories like this, hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps the channel, and I promise you this one has more turns in it than you're expecting. Now let's get back to it. When Elaine and I married, Ashley was 9, considerably too young to have any real say in whether a new man entered her mother's life, and considerably too raw from losing her own father to welcome one, even if she'd had the choice. I understood that going in, and I want to be honest that I expected the difficulty to soften over time, the way these things usually do, given patience and consistency, and the ordinary accumulation of shared years. For the first 3 years, it mostly did. I remember specific moments from those early years with a fondness that makes everything that followed considerably harder to sit with in retrospect. I taught Ashley to ride a bike the summer she turned 10, running alongside her down our quiet street in the Pacific, sweating patience the task requires, and I remember the exact look on her face the first time she pedaled a full block without my hand on the seat, turning back to check whether I'd seen it. I helped her build a science fair project about erosion patterns when she was 11. The two of us spending a Saturday afternoon in the backyard, experimenting with different soil compositions and garden hoses. And I remember her mother, Elaine, watching us from the kitchen window with an expression I only fully understood, years later, as the specific look of a woman watching something she'd hoped for finally start to take root. There was a specific Saturday morning ritual, too, during those first 3 years. The two of us driving to the farmer's market on Marion Square most weekends while Elaine slept in. Ashley picking out specific vegetables she decided she wanted to try cooking that week, working her way through an ambitious, entirely self-directed project of learning to cook one new dish every month. I still remember the specific, delighted pride on her face the first time she successfully made a full dinner entirely on her own, insisting Elaine and I sit at the table while she served us. 12 years old and glowing with an accomplishment she'd clearly been building toward for weeks. Ashley warmed to me gradually, the specific, cautious way children do when they are testing whether an adult is actually going to stick around. And by the time she was 12, I genuinely believed we were building something real, not a replacement for Marcus, who she never stopped loving and who I never once tried to compete with, but a second, different kind of relationship that was becoming, in its own right, something worth having. If you've been enjoying stories like this, hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps the channel, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. Now let's get back to it. Everything changed when Ashley was 13, the same year Elaine received her first cancer diagnosis, an early-stage breast cancer that was caught, treated aggressively, and that her oncologist told us, cautiously but with real confidence, had an excellent 5-year survival outlook. I want to describe the specific conversation Elaine and I had, alone in our kitchen, about 10 days after that diagnosis, because it is the conversation that explains everything that happened between Ashley and me for the following 13 years, right up until the funeral I'm describing. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe, because the next part is where this story stops being simple. Elaine told me, sitting at our kitchen table with a diagnosis that was, statistically, considerably more hopeful than frightening, that she was terrified of something specific, something she said she hadn't fully articulated even to herself until she watched Ashley's face when we told her about the diagnosis. Ashley had already lost one parent to cancer. Elaine watched her 13-year-old daughter absorb the news of a second cancer diagnosis, this time in the mother who was her only remaining biological parent. And she told me she saw, in Ashley's face, a specific, devastating terror that went beyond ordinary worry, something closer to a child bracing for a second catastrophic loss she genuinely believed was inevitable. I remember Elaine describing that moment in specific, painful detail, the way Ashley had gone completely silent when we told her, not crying, not asking questions, simply going still in a way that Elaine said reminded her, with a specific dread, of exactly how Ashley had reacted the day they told her Marcus wasn't coming home from the hospital. Elaine told me she'd spent the following 10 days unable to stop replaying that specific stillness, understanding it as evidence of a wound in her daughter that hadn't actually healed in the 18 months since Marcus's death, only gone quiet, waiting, apparently, for exactly this kind of second blow to reopen it completely. "I need to ask you something," Elaine told me that night, "and I need you to actually hear the reasoning before you react to it, because I know how." She told me she wanted me to pull back, deliberately, from the closeness Ashley and I had built over the preceding 3 years. Not cruelly, not completely, but enough, she said, that if her cancer came back, if she eventually died and left Ashley without either biological parent, Ashley wouldn't also be losing a second deeply bonded parental figure at the same time, compounding one devastating loss with another. Elaine believed, and she'd apparently been turning this over privately for days before she raised it with me, that a more distant, cordial relationship between Ashley and me would actually protect her daughter, would give her one relationship in her life that wasn't built on a foundation of loss waiting to happen again. If this story has you hooked, drop a comment and hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I still think about most. I want to be honest that I argued with her, that first night, more than I've argued with almost anyone about almost anything in my entire life. I told her the reasoning felt backward to me, that distancing myself from Ashley wouldn't protect her from grief. It would simply add a second, quieter grief on top of whatever else she was already carrying. The specific grief of watching a parent figure, who used to be warm, become inexplicably cooler for reasons she'd never be. Elaine didn't disagree with that risk. She told me she understood it completely, had spent days sitting with exactly that same fear before deciding, on balance, that the version of protection she was asking for still felt like the right one to her, a mother's specific, imperfect calculation made under circumstances neither of us had ever had to navigate before. I agreed to it. I want to be honest about that, sitting here telling you this story, because I think the honesty matters more than making myself look like an unwilling participant in something I actually chose. I loved Elaine considerably more than I trusted my own judgment against hers on a question this specifically maternal, this specifically about protecting a child from a kind of loss Elaine herself had already survived once as a widow, raising Ashley alone for those 18 months before I ever entered their lives. I told her I would do it. And starting that same month, I began, deliberately, carefully, in ways I hoped Ashley would never fully register as deliberate, pulling back. If you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button, because it really does help the channel keep going, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. I want to describe what that pulling back actually looked like, because I think the specific texture of it matters for understanding how completely it reshaped 13 years of our relationship. I stopped attending Ashley's soccer games as consistently as I had before, sending Elaine alone more often than not, always with some plausible excuse about the store. I stopped initiating the easy, ordinary conversations we'd built up over 3 years, the specific rhythm of a stepfather and a stepdaughter slowly becoming genuinely comfortable with each other, replacing it with a polite, considerably more formal warmth that I maintained with a discipline that cost me more than I let either of them see. I remember specific nights sitting in my own living room, watching Ashley do homework at the kitchen table 20 feet away, physically restraining myself from going over to help her the way I once would have, understanding that the small, ordinary intimacies of parenting were exactly the things Elaine had asked me to gradually withdraw. I remember one particular evening, maybe 8 months into the new distance, when Ashley came to me with a math problem she was stuck on, the exact kind of moment that would have, a year earlier, turned into 45 minutes of us working through it together at the kitchen table. I helped her that night, but I remember doing it with a specific, deliberate brevity, answering her question efficiently, and then finding a reason to leave the room rather than lingering the way I used to. And I remember the small, confused flicker that crossed her face when I did it, a child registering, without yet having the language to name it, that something about our relationship had subtly, unexplainably shifted. There was a specific birthday party, the year Ashley turned 15, that I still think about with a particular ache. She'd invited a handful of friends over, and I remember standing in the kitchen doorway most of that evening, close enough to hear the laughter from the living room, deliberately keeping my distance from the celebration in a way that I told myself at the time was simply giving teenagers their space, but that I understood even then was actually the specific, engineered coolness Elaine had asked of me extending itself into yet another ordinary family moment. It had no reason. Elaine found me in that doorway at one point, and I remember the look she gave me, a specific, silent acknowledgement of exactly what we were both asking me to sacrifice, night after night, in service of a fear that felt, at the time, entirely justified. High school brought its own version of the distance. Ashley increasingly independent in the ordinary way teenagers become, which made my own deliberate withdrawal easier to disguise as simply respecting her growing autonomy rather than the specific, engineered coolness it actually was. I attended her high school graduation, certainly, sat in the audience alongside Elaine, applauded when her name was called, but I remember the specific ache of watching her scan the crowd afterward, finding her mother immediately, and taking a beat longer to find me, standing a few feet back, before offering me a hug that felt, even then, more obligatory than the ones she gave her mother. Elaine's cancer went into remission that same year, and stayed in remission for nearly a decade, a fact that meant the specific protective calculation she'd made when Ashley was 13 never actually got tested the way either of us had feared it might. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because it's the central, devastating irony of this entire story. Elaine asked me to distance myself from Ashley to protect her from a second parental loss that, as it turned out, wasn't coming for another 13 years. In the meantime, the distance itself became the actual, ongoing loss Ashley experienced, day after day for over a decade, a loss she had no way of understanding the reason for, because neither Elaine nor I ever told her. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps more than. I asked Elaine more than once over those years, particularly once her remission had stretched past 5 years and then 8, whether we should finally tell Ashley the truth, whether the original protective logic still applied now that the immediate danger had clearly passed. Elaine's answer, each time, was some version of the same hesitation, that reopening it now would force Ashley to reprocess an entire adolescence and young adulthood through a completely different lens, that the damage, whatever it was, had already been done, and that unpacking it now, without an active crisis forcing the conversation, risked hurting Ashley in a new way rather than actually helping her heal from the old one. I remember one specific conversation, the year Ashley turned 21, when I raised it with particular urgency, having just watched her celebrate her birthday with a small circle of college friends, laughing and warm and entirely herself, in a way that made the careful distance she maintained with me feel, that particular evening, especially stark by comparison. I told Elaine that night that I thought we owed Ashley the truth as an adult, capable of understanding complicated parental decisions in a way a teenager simply couldn't be expected to. Elaine agreed with the principle, she told me, but asked for 6 more months, then another 6, a pattern that repeated itself gradually across the following years, until neither of us was tracking with any real precision how long 6 more months had actually stretched into. I want to be honest that I disagreed with that reasoning more each year it continued, watching Ashley grow into an adult who kept me at the exact same careful, polite distance I'd first built when she was 13, watching her graduate high school, then college, then start her career, each milestone attended by a version of me that Ashley experienced as fundamentally, permanently reserved, never once understanding that the reservation had a specific origin point and if increasingly outdated, protective purpose behind it. I raised the subject with Elaine for what turned out to be the final time about 8 months before her lung cancer diagnosis, and she told me again that she wasn't ready, that she needed more time to figure out how to explain it to Ashley in a way that wouldn't feel like an accusation against 13 years of Ashley's own understanding of our family. If you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button, because it really does help the channel keep going, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. Elaine's lung cancer diagnosis came 8 months before she died, considerably more aggressive and considerably less treatable than the breast cancer she'd survived 13 years earlier. And I want to describe the specific, complicated relief and terror I felt during those final months, understanding that whatever was going to happen to our family's long-deferred conversation with Ashley was now going to happen under genuine crisis conditions. The exact circumstances Elaine had always said she wanted to avoid forcing the truth into. I remember the specific texture of those 8 months, a stretch that required both of us to hold 2 entirely different projects simultaneously. The ordinary, exhausting work of managing Elaine's declining health, appointments and medications, and the slow, visible erosion of a woman who had always seemed, to me, essentially indestructible, alongside the quieter, harder work of finally, belatedly, deciding what to do about 13 years of unexplained distance with her. Ashley came home from Atlanta every other weekend during those months, and I want to be honest that watching her sit at her mother's bedside, offering a warmth and devotion that never once extended to me in the adjoining room, was its own specific, private grief I carried throughout that entire stretch, understanding, even then, that I had no right to resent a coldness I had spent 13 years deliberately cultivating. I remember one particular weekend, maybe 5 months into Elaine's decline, when Ashley and I found ourselves alone together in the kitchen, for the first time in longer than I could easily remember, both of us making coffee at the same small counter, neither of us quite sure what to say to fill the silence. She asked me that morning, in a voice that carried more genuine curiosity than I'd heard from her toward me in years, how I was actually holding up, a small, ordinary kindness that nonetheless struck me as significant enough that I remember it clearly even now, wondering, in that moment, whether the crisis of her mother's decline was quietly softening some of the distance neither of us had ever fully explained. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps more than you'd think. Elaine wrote the letter during her final 6 weeks, working on it in short stretches when her energy allowed, telling me only that she was finally writing Ashley the explanation, without showing me the contents directly, a specific privacy I respected even though I desperately wanted to know what she'd finally decided to say. I remember watching her work on it some evenings, a legal pad balanced on her lap in the hospital bed we'd set up in our own bedroom during those final weeks. Her handwriting, once precise and confident, growing visibly shakier with each passing week as the cancer progressed. And I remember the specific discipline it took not to ask what she was writing, respecting the process she'd asked to keep private even as every part of me wanted to know. She sealed it herself, gave it to me 3 days before she died, and told me, holding my hand with what strength she had left, that I would know when the right moment was to give it to Ashley, that she trusted my judgment about the timing even though she'd never fully trusted either of our judgment about the timing of telling Ashley anything for the preceding 13 years. I remember the weight of that sealed envelope in my hands, considerably heavier than a single folded page had any physical right to feel, understanding that I was being handed not just a letter, but the final, most important decision of Elaine's entire complicated calculation about her daughter. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because this one isn't finished yet. I did not give Ashley that letter immediately. I want to be honest about why, because I think the honesty matters. I was afraid, genuinely afraid, that handing a devastated 26-year-old woman a letter explaining 13 years of her stepfather's calculated emotional distance, in the same week she buried her mother, would be its own kind of cruelty, adding an enormous, complicated new piece of information onto a grief that was already, in that first week, more than either of us could fully carry. I told myself I would find the right moment. I carried that letter sealed in the inside pocket of different coats and jackets for 4 months, waiting for a moment that never quite announced itself as the right one. The funeral happened on a warm April afternoon, 4 months after Elaine's death, delayed that long because of a specific, complicated dispute within Elaine's extended family about arrangements that I won't detail here, because it isn't the actual point of this. I want to describe the specific atmosphere of that funeral, because I think it matters for understanding how Ashley's accusation actually landed. It was, by every measure, a beautiful service, the church full, the eulogies warm, Elaine's specific, considerable impact on hundreds of lives across 3 decades in Charleston fully, appropriately honored. I remember the specific quality of that April afternoon, sunlight coming through the church's stained glass windows in a way that felt, at various points during the service, almost inappropriately beautiful given the weight of what we were all there to do. Elaine's book club of 22 years attended in full, sitting together in a block near the front, several of them crying openly through most of the service. Her hospice nurse from the final weeks came, standing quietly near the back, and approached me afterward to tell me, with genuine warmth, what an extraordinary patient Elaine had been, the specific detail landing with a particular ache given everything else happening in my chest that day. Several of my own employees from the hardware store attended too, men and women who'd known Elaine for years through countless store events and holiday parties, and I remember the specific comfort of their presence in that pew section behind me. A reminder, even in the middle of everything else that afternoon, that Elaine's impact had genuinely extended into every corner of both our lives, not just the complicated, private one Ashley and I were carrying. Ashley asked to speak, near the end of the service, after two of Elaine's closest friends had already given warm, careful eulogies, and I remember watching her walk to that podium with a specific, controlled composure that I now understand, looking back, was already cracking underneath before she'd said a single word. She spoke for the first 2 minutes, beautifully, about her mother's specific warmth, her mother's fierce, protective love, the particular way Elaine had rebuilt a life for both of them after Marcus died, when Ashley was 8 years old and Elaine was a widow with a mortgage and a young daughter, and considerably more grief than any one person should be asked to carry alone. I remember watching her hands grip the podium's edges as she spoke, her voice steady through the section about her mother, and I remember, in retrospect, the exact moment her composure began to shift, a specific pause after describing Elaine's remarriage that lasted a beat longer than the rhythm of the rest of her eulogy, as though she were deciding, in real time, standing in front of 200 people, whether to say the thing she'd apparently been carrying, unspoken, for considerably longer than that single afternoon, and then, with no visible transition, no warning in her voice, Ashley looked directly at me, sitting in the front pew, and said the sentence that this whole story is built around. "He never really loved my mother," she said, her voice carrying a specific, brittle finality that told the entire room immediately that this wasn't a spontaneous outburst but something she'd been carrying unspoken for a very long time. 17 years, and he never once let either of us all the way in. I used to think it was me. I used to think there was something wrong with me that he couldn't love. I've spent 13 years wondering what I did. If you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button, because it really does help the channel keep going. I want to describe what it felt like sitting in that front pew, hearing my stepdaughter describe, in front of 200 people, the exact wound I had spent 13 years watching open and never once explained the origin of, understanding in real time that Elaine's original fear, that the distance itself would become its own devastating loss, had turned out to be exactly, precisely correct, and that I had let it happen for 13 years out of loyalty to a protective calculation that had stopped making sense the moment Elaine's cancer first went into remission. I did not stand up and correct her in front of 200 people. I want to explain why, because I think it matters. Ashley's grief in that moment, standing at her own mother's funeral, was not a grief that needed a public rebuttal, however wrong the specific accusation was. It needed, I understood immediately, a private, careful truth, delivered with the full context Elaine had spent her final 6 weeks constructing, not a defensive correction shouted across a church full of mourners that would have humiliated her in front of everyone she knew. If this story has you hooked, drop a comment and hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I still think about most. I found Ashley in the church's small reception room nearly an hour later, after most of the guests had moved on to the graveside service, sitting alone in a folding chair with her makeup smudged and her composure entirely gone. The specific exhaustion of a woman who had just said, out loud, in front of everyone, a wound she'd been carrying silently for 13 years. I sat down across from her, and I want to describe the specific care I took choosing my first words, because I understood I was not going to get a second chance to have this conversation land the way it needed to. I remember standing in the doorway of that reception room for a moment before entering, watching her shoulders shake with a kind of crying that looked entirely different from the composed grief she'd shown at the podium. A rawer, more private version of the same devastation. And I remember the specific fear I felt, understanding that whatever I said in the next few minutes was going to either begin repairing 13 years of damage or deepen it in ways that might never fully heal. I closed the door quietly behind me, giving us privacy from the few remaining guests still moving through the hallway outside, and I pulled a second folding chair close enough to sit across from her, without crowding the space she clearly needed. "I need to give you something your mother wrote," I told her, reaching into my coat pocket for the letter I had carried sealed for 4 months. "And I need to tell you something before you read it, because I think you deserve to hear it from me directly, not just from a letter. Everything you said today about the distance being real, you're right about that. It was real, and it was there for 13 years, and I let it happen. But you're wrong about why, and I think your mother's letter is going to explain it better than I can, because she's the one who asked me to do it." I watched Ashley's face when I said that, a specific, complicated mixture of confusion and a kind of guarded, disbelieving hope crossing it in quick succession. The expression of someone who has spent 13 years building an entire understanding of her own life around one explanation, and is suddenly being asked to consider that the explanation might have been wrong the entire time. She didn't say anything for a long moment, just looked at the sealed envelope in my outstretched hand, and I remember the specific stillness of that reception room, muffled sounds of the graveside service filtering faintly through the walls, both of us suspended in a silence neither of us seemed ready to break first. If you've been enjoying stories like this, hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps the channel, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. I want to describe watching Ashley open that letter, because I think it's the most important moment in this entire story. Her hands were shaking, and I watched her read her mother's handwriting for what felt like a very long time, her expression shifting through several distinct stages I could track even without knowing exactly which sentence she was reading at each moment: confusion, then a kind of dawning horror, then something that looked almost like grief layered on top of grief. Understanding, in real time, that the coldness she'd spent 13 years internalizing as evidence of her own unlovability had actually been her mother's own imperfect, desperate attempt to protect her from a loss that, as it turned out, hadn't come until 13 years later than either of them feared. I watched her read specific passages more than once, her eyes moving back up the page as though checking that she'd actually understood what she'd just read the first time. And I remember the specific sound she made partway through, a small, involuntary gasp that told me she'd reached the section where Elaine explained the original 13-year-old version of Ashley's face, the specific terror Elaine had described seeing that had driven the entire decision. She read for nearly 10 minutes, considerably longer than the letter's actual length probably required, and I understood, watching her, that she was reading it multiple times, trying to fully absorb something that fundamentally reorganized her understanding of the last 13 years of her own life. Elaine's letter, which Ashley eventually let me read months later, explained everything I've just told you, in her own words, with a specific, devastating honesty about her own fear as a mother who had already watched her daughter lose one parent, and could not bear the thought of her losing a second one under circumstances that felt, at the time, terrifyingly imminent. She wrote about the specific stillness she'd seen in Ashley's face the day of the second diagnosis, described it in almost the exact language she'd used with me that first night at our kitchen table 13 years earlier. And she wrote, with a specific clarity I hadn't expected given how weak she'd been in her final weeks, about exactly how she'd asked me to help, and exactly why she'd never found the courage to revisit the decision, even once the original danger. She wrote that she understood, by the time she was writing that letter from her own deathbed, that the calculation had been wrong, that 13 years of distance had cost Ashley something considerably larger than the loss it was meant to prevent, and that she was asking, in her final weeks, for a forgiveness she did not feel entitled to but desperately hoped Ashley could eventually find anyway for both of us. The letter's final paragraph, Ashley told me much later, asked her directly to give me a chance to explain the rest, to not let her mother's own imperfect decision become one more reason to close a door that Elaine believed, even in her final weeks, still had genuine warmth behind it, however badly that warmth had been obscured. If you're finding this story compelling, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps more than you'd think. I want to describe the specific, wrenching conversation Ashley and I had in that small reception room, once she'd finished reading, because it did not resolve cleanly, and I don't think an honest telling of this story pretends that it did. She was angry, genuinely, deeply angry, not only at the original decision, but at the 13 years of silence that followed it, the specific, compounding betrayal of watching both her mother and her stepfather choose, repeatedly, not to tell her the truth even as she grew from a frightened 13-year-old into an adult fully capable of understanding complicated, imperfect parental decisions made out of love and fear in equal measure. "You could have told me when I was 18, she said, her voice raw. "You could have told me in college. You had 13 years, and every single year you both decided I still couldn't handle it. Do you understand how that feels? Finding out at my mother's funeral that the entire shape of our relationship was a decision made about me instead of with me, 13 years ago, and never once revisited. I remember sitting with that accusation for a long moment before responding, understanding that any defense I offered too quickly was going to sound like exactly the kind of excuse-making that had already cost us 13 years. I told her I didn't have a clean answer for why we kept waiting, that each individual year the silence continued had its own small, specific justification that made sense in isolation. She was still too young. She was in the middle of a hard semester. The timing never felt right. But that stacked together across 13 years. Those small justifications amounted to something considerably harder to defend, a pattern of avoidance dressed up as protection. She asked me at one point whether I had ever actually wanted to tell her, whether any part of me had pushed back against the ongoing silence the way Elaine's letter suggested I initially had. I told her yes, honestly, that I had raised it with her mother more than once over the years, particularly once the remission had stretched past 5 years and then 8, and that each time, Elaine's hesitation had won out over my own growing conviction that the truth, however painful, would have cost Ashley less than another year of unexplained distance. I told her I regretted, more than almost anything else in my adult life, not pushing harder, not simply telling her myself regardless of Elaine's reluctance, understanding, even as I said it, that this admission complicated rather than simplified my own role in the 13 years of silence. If you've made it this far into the story, hit that subscribe button, because it really does help the channel keep going, and we've got a lot more coming in this one. I did not have a fully adequate answer to that, sitting across from her in that small church reception room, because I think she was right, and I told her so directly. I told her that Elaine and I had both, at various points, believed we were protecting her, and that somewhere along the way, protection had curdled into something closer to cowardice, a comfortable, well-intentioned excuse for avoiding a conversation that only got harder to have with every additional year we let pass. I told her I understood if she needed time, considerable time, before she could think about either of us, her mother's memory included, without this new, complicated context reshaping everything. We did not resolve everything that afternoon, and I want to be honest that the months since have been their own slow, uneven process, considerably harder than I think either of us expected, even understanding the full explanation behind the distance. Ashley moved back to Charleston about 6 weeks after the funeral, not to live with me, but close enough that we could begin, slowly, carefully, the specific work of rebuilding 13 years of relationship on an entirely different foundation than the one we'd both unknowingly been standing on the whole time. I remember the specific awkwardness of our first few dinners together after she moved back, both of us visibly unpracticed at a kind of directness neither of us had ever actually built between us, even before the distance began. I remember our second dinner particularly, at a small Italian restaurant near her new apartment, both of us reaching for the same safe, surface-level conversation topics we'd relied on for years, until Ashley, partway through the meal, set down her fork and said simply, This is exactly what I don't want us to keep doing. A specific, brave interruption of our old pattern that opened that evening into the first genuinely unguarded conversation we'd had in longer than either of us could easily calculate. We started seeing a family therapist together, a decision Ashley proposed herself about a month after the funeral, telling me she didn't think either of us had the tools to navigate this kind of repair without professional guidance. And I want to describe those early sessions as genuinely difficult, considerably more so than I expected, working through 13 years of accumulated small moments that each needed to be individually re-examined and understood in their new context. Our therapist, a careful, patient woman named Dr. Renata Acaffer, told us something during one of our early sessions that I've thought about often since. That repairing a relationship built on a hidden foundation isn't simply a matter of removing the concealment and returning to how things might have been. The 13 years of distance had shaped both of us, she pointed out, not just Ashley's understanding of me, but my own instincts around how much warmth I allowed myself to show. A habit built so deeply into 13 years of deliberate restraint that unlearning it was proving considerably harder than either of us anticipated, even now that the original reason for the restraint no longer applied. I remember a specific exercise Dr. Acaffer gave us during our third session, asking each of us separately to write down 3 specific memories we'd each interpreted very differently at the time, and to bring them to compare the following week. Ashley brought the 16th birthday party I mentioned earlier, describing it from her side as the moment she'd finally concluded definitively that I simply didn't care to be part of her life in any meaningful way. I brought the same memory, describing the specific physical effort it had taken me to stay in that kitchen doorway rather than walk into the living room and actually celebrate with her the way I desperately wanted to. Hearing both versions read aloud in the same room for the first time was one of the more disorienting experiences of my adult life. Understanding just how completely 2 people could live through the identical moment and walk away with entirely opposite understandings of what it meant. If you've been enjoying stories like this, hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps the channel. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because this one isn't finished yet. I didn't know, sitting in that small reception room watching Ashley read her mother's final letter, that the specific process of rebuilding our relationship was going to require considerably more than a single explanation, that Ashley was going to need, over the following months, to revisit entire stretches of her adolescence and young adulthood through this new lens, reconstructing memories she'd carried for over a decade, with an entirely different understanding of what had actually been happening underneath them. I didn't know that she was going to find, going through some of her mother's old belongings 6 weeks later, an earlier, unsent letter Elaine had apparently started writing when Ashley turned 18, abandoned halfway through, that suggested Elaine had come considerably closer to telling her the truth years earlier than either of us had realized. A discovery that was going to complicate this story's already complicated shape even further. But that's a story for next time. The truest thing I can tell you, several months removed from that funeral, is that love expressed as protection can become, without either party ever intending it, its own form of harm, and that the line between protecting someone and simply failing to trust them with the truth is considerably thinner than either Elaine or I understood at the time we first crossed it. Elaine loved Ashley enough to try to shield her from a devastating loss. She loved her enough, too, in the end, to write the truth down before it was too late to matter at all. I am still learning, months later, what it actually means to rebuild a relationship with a woman who spent 13 years believing I simply didn't love her mother enough to let either of them fully in, when the truth was so much more complicated and so much more painful than that simple, devastating sentence she said at the podium ever captured. I think often about the specific, impossible position Elaine occupied 13 years ago, sitting at that kitchen table with a diagnosis that turned out, eventually, to be considerably less dangerous than the fear it produced. I don't think there was a clean, correct answer available to her in that moment, watching her 13-year-old daughter's face go still with a terror Elaine recognized all too well from her own experience of loss. I think she made the best decision she knew how to make with the information and the fear she had at the time. And I think, too, that the specific tragedy of this story is how much that decision cost, not because it was made, but because neither of us found the courage to revisit it once the circumstances that justified it had clearly changed. Ashley and I talk now, most weeks, careful, still rebuilding conversations that carry a specific new honesty neither of us quite knew how to access during the preceding 13 years. I've told her things about those years I never thought I'd say out loud, the specific ache of watching her from a distance I'd chosen, the particular guilt of restraining myself from helping with a math problem, or attending a soccer game, small moments that accumulated across 13 years into a relationship neither of us fully understood we were both quietly grieving the whole time. She's told me things, too, about specific memories she'd built an entire narrative around, moments she'd interpreted as evidence of my indifference that she's now had to reconsider entirely. Understanding that a father who seemed cold at her 16th birthday party had actually spent that entire evening fighting the urge to be exactly as warm as he actually felt. I visited Elaine's grave last month, alone, on what would have been her 61st birthday, and I found myself talking to her the way I've done occasionally since she died, telling her, this time, that Ashley and I were finding our way back to something real, slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely, and that I understood now in a way I hadn't fully understood even while agreeing to her original request 13 years ago. Exactly how much that particular kind of protective love can cost the people it's meant to shield. I brought flowers that day, the specific yellow roses Elaine kept in a vase on our kitchen table for most of our marriage, and I stood at that headstone for a considerably longer time than I'd planned, working through, out loud, in the particular way grief sometimes needs to be spoken rather than simply thought, everything I wished I'd said to her while she was still alive to hear it, that I understood her fear, that I didn't blame her for the decision even now, fully understanding its cost, and that I was going to spend whatever years I had left trying to give Ashley the version of a father figure that 13 years of careful distance had never quite let either of us build. I don't think Elaine would have chosen differently, given the same fear and the same limited information she had at the time. I think if she could see where Ashley and I have ended up now, she would simply be grateful that the truth finally found its way out before it was too late for either of us to do anything with it. If this story moved you, let me know in the comments and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next. Thanks for being here. For real.